Hi, I'm John Messer. Welcome back to Understanding Your Church with Systems Thinking. This is session 3, and we're going to talk about systems thinking tools. So as we look forward, I'll give you the 3 most powerful systems thinking tools and how they work, and this will get you a long way into applying systems thinking in everyday life. The first systems tool is called the systems iceberg. It seems like every field has an iceberg illustration, and of course the iceberg is where you see the top small portion above the water. The rest of it is underneath and unseen, and the same is true of systems thinking. So the iceberg in systems thinking is divided into 4 sections. And so above the surface, what we see are events. We can ask the question, what's happening? And what we see that's happening is an event. And then immediately below the surface are the patterns of behavior or the trends over time. And those are immediately below the surface, but below that is system structure. And we answer the question, how are the parts related? What influences patterns and trends? But at the very foundational level, at the deepest level, the most unseen level, so to speak, are mental models. And mental models are very powerful in systems thinking. They are subconscious explanations of how things work. And they're built on our values, our beliefs, our assumptions, our experiences that we have gained over the course of our lifetimes. And mental models are very important, but they are not quantitative. You can't quantify a mental model. It's all qualitative. It is something unseen that we need to surface if we're going to see transformation in our systems. What's important to understand about the systems iceberg is that the deeper we go into the iceberg, so from the surface of events, the deeper we go, the more influence or the more power we have to change things. That's called increasing leverage. So while we have very little ability to change events, all we can really do is react to events. We have significant ability to bring change with mental models. Mental models are the point where we transform organizations and we bring deep change. So at the level of patterns, we can anticipate trends. At the level of structure, we can organize. And so the point of the iceberg is that what we want to do is think through this in a systematic way, so that we think, well, this event happened, what pattern are we seeing, what are the structures that underlie that, and then what mental models might be influencing those structures. So ultimately what we see is that mental models drive so much of what happens in an organization from a systems perspective. So level 1, the event, let's think about this from a church perspective. So what's happening in our church? For example, perhaps you had the lowest attendance ever, or no one showed for prayer, or you couldn't pay the mortgage one month, or a key family left. That is the event of the iceberg. That is what you experienced. That's what you saw. But if you engage that, all you can do really is react to that. And we're not really about reacting. We don't want to react. That's linear thinking. We want to find out what's really going on, what's happening at the deeper levels. So we look for patterns. Are there any patterns that we find that are related to that? For example, actually, a key family left, but our attendance has been in a downward trend for the last 6 months. We've been losing people for 6 months. Or regarding prayer, not only did a person not show, but actually interest in prayer and attendance at prayer meetings has decreased over the last number of months. Or we've lost several key people or families. So those patterns then are based on structures. So the structure that we talk about is how are the parts of the system connected? How are the parts of the church system connected or related in such a way that might be influencing those patterns? For example, where do we see dissatisfaction in the system? That's evidence of a structural problem. What's the feedback we're getting? What are we hearing from people about why they don't come to prayer or why they have left? Or those things can help us understand that the structure of the church is faulty and we need to work on that. Another thing is that we can look at mental models, because mental models are the basis of the structure which influences pattern, which is displayed in events. So for example, when we hear complaints about worship, one mental model that we could perhaps surface is that, well, worship is about me and my needs. It's about me. It's about what I want. Or we could hear things like, worship is just an event. It doesn't have anything to do with daily life. Or we could say that the mental model that is surfacing is, well, worship has to be exactly like this, and if it's not like this, then it's wrong. All of those things are mental models, and all of those will drive how the church is structured, how that church system is structured, and that will produce patterns of behavior over time. And so it's important to be able to get to the point to identify what are the mental models that are being represented when we're dealing with the problems. So the point is simply that as we're thinking about systems, we can think through this in a systemic way about events. We can see what's happening. We can then think about patterns and trends. We can then think about structure, how things are related. And then we can think about what mental models might be represented here. What mental models are driving all of this? And again, if we want to change happens at the deepest level, structures and mental models. Otherwise, all we're doing is reacting or maybe anticipating that we're going to have more of the same. Once we have gone through the systems iceberg, then with the issue or the problem that we're analyzing in systems thinking, we would go to our next tool, which is called a behavior over time graph. In short, it's a BOT, B-O-T, BOT graph. Behavior over time graphs help us identify the patterns and their underlying causes. They really help us focus on change over time rather than just events. So what they do is they lay out for us what has been happening over a period of time, and that period of time can be days, weeks, months, years, depending on the size and the depth of the problem. But behavior over time graphs really encourage us to think about the underlying causes. What's driving this? And they also then get us ready to examine the relationships among those variables at a deeper level. They prepare us, they give us information that we use for a thing called a causal loop diagram, which is the biggest tool that we have. So constructing a behavior over time graph is really a plot. It's an XY graph, and we plot both soft data and we can plot hard data, but most of the data that we plot in a social system like a church is soft. It's qualitative data. Quantitative things are important, but most of the things that are the most important in churches are qualitative. So, for example, we can plot the quality of sleep or the quality of our diet, or we can plot stress. They don't have to be hard numbers. We graph the variable on a graph over a period of time, listing the variables on the left and the time on the horizontal axis. And then encourage ourselves to ask the question, so what is changing? What do we see that's changing here? How is it changing? And then why is it changing? Asking those questions as we produce the graph is what helps us to gain insight into the system and the system behavior. So for example, let's use the situation of the quality of our sleep or the amount of our sleep, our diet quality, work stress, and colds. So in this case, we've been getting more colds, and we find that that pattern has been continuing, and we've identified that factors we think are important are diet quality and work stress and sleep. And so you can see just by the visual that when we plot those over time, and we'll say this is a matter of like 6 months, we see that colds go up and work stress go up, while sleep and diet quality are going down. But this really demonstrates the reality that a bot graph shows the ways that the parts of a system are related, or the variables. We call these sleep, work, stress, diet quality, and colds, we call them variables. So what we're finding is that we see two that are going down, we see two that are going up, and so we can say they have a positive correlation. And as one goes up, the other goes down, that's a negative correlation. And so we get an idea a little bit more about what's really happening here. So this is just a little bit more of an explanation of that graph. So the positive correlation between stress and colds is very interesting. And then the diet quality and sleep are also positively correlated. As one goes down, the other goes down. But then we also have the negative correlations between stress and diet quality and colds and sleep. The more colds we have, the less sleep we get, or the less sleep we get, the more colds we get. The point is simply that there is some kind of a relationship, of a correlation there. And what we're doing is simply identifying what we believe is most important and attempting to then explain what the causal relationship is between those. Because when we start thinking about those variables, what we will do next is take what we have learned from the behavior over time graph, and we will plot those in more detail on a causal loop diagram, which looks at the causal relationships in detail. So constructing a bot graph is a really important step. It's a wonderful tool to give ourselves a visual. If nothing else, it helps us think through what's really going on here. Putting this on paper, and it doesn't have to be formal, it can be very informal, but just plotting this helps us to gain insight. It helps us ask better questions. It has a way of just spurring our thinking. As we think through our iceberg and then we plot what we believe are the most important variables, we start to see why is it important? Why is work stress important? What is it about that variable? What does stress have to do with the rest of the story here? Is stress really as powerful as we think it is? What are the most important relationships? What's most important? Is diet quality most important, or is sleep most important? Is it stress that's most important? It would seem that colds would be a symptom of a deeper problem to me. But now, is it that sleep is the major variable, or is it stress that's a major variable? Is diet quality a symptom, or is that a driver of what's happening here? So it causes us to examine our processes in ways that give us more detail and help us understand better what's really happening. So the point of a behavior over time graph is to help us to think more deeply, to help us answer really good questions, and perhaps maybe not to answer them, but to ask really good questions anyway. And then it prepares us for the next tool, which is the causal loop diagram. Now, a causal loop diagram is the primary tool that we use in systems thinking, because it is basically a model of what we believe the system is doing. To understand that, we need to have a little bit of understanding of the parts of a causal loop diagram. And so we'll see this a link between two variables. And so we call these causal links and the polarity. So this means that we have two variables, variable 1 and variable 2, and the line between them says that variable 1 influences variable 2. And we see an S here, and the S stands for same. That means a positive correlation. So as variable 1 increases, variable 2 increases. Now here's a negative between two variables, variable 1 and variable 2, and that's an O for opposite or negative. And so as variable 1 increases, variable 2 decreases. So the point is simply that for every variable, we will note a relationship between them, and we mark it with a sign of polarity, either S for same or O for opposite. There are people who use pluses and minuses, and that's perfectly fine. I have found that using S's and O's for same and opposite is easier for people who are more quantitatively wired. It sometimes makes it difficult for people because they start thinking in mathematical terms. And this is not really a mathematical model. It's a qualitative model. So I use same and opposite, but you can use plus and minus. So what we do then is we find that actually these variables form loops. So the relationship between variable 1 and variable 2 actually has two aspects. There's the aspect where variable 1 influences variable 2, and then in a reinforcing loop, variable 2 also then influences variable 1. So if we have a situation where the variable increases another and that reinforces, that's a reinforcing loop. So the polarity is the same. It's the same. It's the same. As variable 1 increases, variable 2 increases. As variable 2 increases, variable 1 increases. So this is an example of, for interest. If you left all of your money in the bank and got unimaginable 8% interest every year, eventually your money will simply continue to grow and grow and grow. A reinforcing loop is a very common thing in social systems. There are either reinforcing loops or balancing loops. But the two kinds of reinforcing loops, there's a positive reinforcing loop, which is a virtuous cycle. And that's really what we have if we're talking about interest in our total bank account. It's increasing in a positive way. If it's a negative relationship, that's called a doom loop, where it will get worse and worse and worse until it either breaks or disappears. So a reinforcing loop can be either in a positive way or a negative way, but the function is the same. Variable 1 increases variable 2 increases variable 1. Or as variable 1 goes down, variable 2 goes down, and as variable 2 goes down, variable 1 goes down. That's the reinforcing loop. So a negative reinforcing loop example is this. In a church situation, let's say that there's congregational dissatisfaction. As that satisfaction increases, leader stress increases. And as leader stress increases, congregational dissatisfaction increases. That's a negative reinforcing loop. Now this reinforcing loop cannot run forever. Something will happen, something will break. People will leave, or a leader can burn out. But this is a very common reinforcing loop in churches, and it's one that we need to be very aware of. Here's a positive reinforcing loop. Now, for example, As we exercise, our overall health goes up, and as our overall health increases, we exercise more. That's a virtuous loop, but that's still a reinforcing loop. But it's a positive reinforcing loop, not a negative one. The polarity is the same. So now the other kind of a loop is a balancing causal loop. A balancing loop, denoted by the B, is where one variable may influence another positively in the same way, but that then has the opposite effect on the other. So another church example. Disputes in a church can act as disputes go up, ministry time in a church goes up. And as ministry time goes up, the disputes go down. So there's a same and an opposite. So as it doesn't continually increase, it's not reinforcing, because as we put in more ministry time, that decreases the disputes and that balances out the loop. Balancing loops prevent the runaway systems. It prevents the burnout or the resource failure or cost overruns that we find in so many organizations. Balancing loops are how thermostats work. The house will get warmer and warmer and warmer up to a point where it automatically kicks in the air conditioning, and then it'll cool it down and it'll keep it within balance. That's a balancing process. So balancing loops are the thermostat of systems. Reinforcing loops are aggressive growth or aggressive reduction. So let's look at the reinforcing loop of pastoral stress. If congregations are dissatisfied, pastoral stress tends to go up. And as pastoral stress goes up, congregational dissatisfaction tends to go up. Why? Well, stress affects pastors in lots of ways. It can be the ability to spend more hours at work. They can't do that anymore, don't have the energy or the ability to deal with as many problems. It reduces their ability to deal with all things in the church, and so it actually increases dissatisfaction. And this is such a typical model. But this reinforcing loop regarding stress is actually the result of linear thinking. And we're going to talk more about this as we go. But this is also indicative that mental models are a fundamental issue in this reinforcing loop. So we'll talk more about this as we go through this course. Just for the sake of understanding that this is the process, this is one loop, this is not a causal loop diagram, this is just one loop. A causal loop diagram has two or more operative loops. But it's just important to understand that we can use these tools to gain a better understanding of what's happening even in smaller things within the church. So here's an example of kind of a Moses ministry system, and this comes from Exodus 18, where Moses was spending more and more time working to meet the needs of the people. And this causal loop diagram, it has two loops. It has a balancing loop with congregational dissatisfaction and ministry time, and then it has a reinforcing loop with ministry time, stress, and dissatisfaction. The point of this is simply to show you how causal loop diagrams work. So Moses initially thought that if he put more time in, that would decrease congregational dissatisfaction. The problem was, what actually was happening is that as he was putting more time in, his workload and his stress were increasing, and that was decreasing his ability to deal with dissatisfaction. And so actually more ministry time increased congregational dissatisfaction. So this didn't really balance anything out. Moses putting more time in didn't balance it out. It actually created a doom loop where it was actually making it worse, and that would eventually lead to burnout. The point of this, of course, is not only do we gain better understanding of exactly why it works the way it does, of what's really happening, but we also then understand that, the leaders are part of the system, and the decisions that they make to do things or not do things, the policies, the actions that they take have consequences. And putting in more ministry time was a decision that he made, and that unintended consequence was increased workload and stress, which impacted the very problem that he was trying to solve. So the unintended consequences, again, remember, are very important in systems thinking. And so this is a model of burnout. This is how burnout happens in a church. And we see it in Scripture in Exodus 18 with Moses. And so just for you to understand, this is a causal loop diagram. It has two loops, one balancing, one reinforcing. And this is a real model of what happens in churches every day. And we can intervene in these things. We'll talk about how we intervene later. But that's a causal loop diagram and how we use them.